Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the first national webinar of the DC Public Prekindergarten Study. My name is Erica Greenberg, and I'm the study's principal investigator, Pre-K-12 team lead, and principal research associate at the Urban Institute. Today's event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterward. Closed captioning is enabled. You can adjust the settings with the Captions button. Speaker biographies are available at urban.org. All participants are muted, but you can type your questions and comments into the Q&A box at any time. We look forward to addressing them in the Q&A portion toward the end of the hour. Please take 1 to 2 minutes to complete the survey at the end of the event. And lastly, we invite you to engage with us online using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. With that, I'm thrilled to kick off our presentation on behalf of a much larger study team, including Breno Braga, who's here with us today, Justin Dormal, Tomas Monares, Leonardo Restrepo, and Rachel Lamb. Breno and I will share findings before turning to our esteemed panel for discussion, followed by Q&A. We're going to start with some motivation from the field of early learning. This will not be a surprise to many of you, but universal public pre-kindergarten programs are increasingly popular in the U.S. 6 states in the District of Columbia currently offer universal public pre-K, and yet most of these programs are focused on 4-year-olds. DC is the exception, offering public pre-K for 3-year-olds as well as 4-year-olds at scale, and yet little is known about the effect of the 3-year-olds program, or pre-K3, on students' short and longer-term outcomes. This project aims to fill that gap in the evidence. In addition, some motivation from the broader field of education. As many of you know, there have been declines in K-12 public school enrollment, which were exacerbated during the pandemic, when more than 1.2 million students dropped from public schools. Enrollment losses were particularly prominent in kindergarten, and an increase in homeschooling explains part of this decline. Yet there are lingering questions about the quality of these alternative learning environments and the resulting financial and operational challenges for school districts. And so we ask, can universal public pre-K offer a solution? These are our primary research questions. Are school-based pre-K3 students more likely to enroll in a public kindergarten program, persist in the public school system, be assigned special education status in kindergarten, switch public schools, or be retained in grade? You'll notice that all of these questions can be answered using administrative data collected by local and state education agencies, and yet they may not get to the core of what many folks want to learn about the effects of early learning programs on early math, early literacy, social and emotional skills, and executive functioning. Stay tuned. We have large-scale primary data collection in the absence of a kindergarten entry assessment across all sectors of the public pre-K program planned for the next couple of school years, and as well as be able to look at 3rd grade test scores, which were paused due to the COVID-19 pandemic and have since returned. So we're eager to get to those early learning outcomes as well. These are our secondary research questions. Do students furthest from opportunity benefit the most from pre-K3? Here we're able to look at residents of communities of color and lower income communities, as well as which program models are the most effective, where we're able to look at dual language and Montessori programs. Now, how do we answer these questions? We're fortunate to be able to leverage a centralized admissions lottery called My School DC for the public pre-K3 program, as well as all other grades. Our method allows us to mimic a randomized control trial for some students. And so we restrict our analyses to those students, about 1/4 of all applicants in the years where we're looking, and compare the later outcomes of students with the same probability of getting a seat in the program. First, just a bit more background on the DC Public Pre-K program itself. DC Pre-K3 is offered on an academic year schedule for 5 days a week, 6.5 hours per day. Most programs offer before and after care, and there's ongoing professional development and pay parity for teachers. There are 14 authorized curricula aligned with DC's comprehensive early learning standards, and in the 2021-22 school year, as in all others of recorded, the DC spent the highest per child enrolled in the nation, more than $20,000. DC Pre-K3 operates in a mixed delivery system with 3 sectors. DC public schools and public charter schools participate in the My School DC lottery, and so they're included in our treatment group. In DCPS, teachers are required to have at least a bachelor's degree. The maximum class size is 16, and they're undergoing curriculum reforms from the creative curriculum and tools of the mind to the evidence-based building blocks math curriculum, focus on early literacy, and anti-bias, anti-racist pedagogy. In public charter schools, operators set their own program and standards. Now, the third sector of the mixed delivery system are community-based organizations. Their operators generally follow DCPS standards and use a variety of curriculum, and yet CBOs do not participate in the My School DC lottery, and so they're included in our control group along with licensed child development centers, licensed child development homes, family friend and neighbor care, and staying home with parents or other family. This is a limitation of our study, but I will note that CBOs are currently a small segment of the pre-K3 system, about 7% of seats in the most recent year of data available. Now, the My School DC lottery for pre-K3 allows all 3-year-old DC residents to be eligible for the program. And the years where we're focused on today, about 3/4 of families with 3-year-olds applied. Applicants can rank up to 12 programs on their list. Programs can give admissions preferences based on several factors, including in-boundary residents for DC public schools, siblings, transfers, and children of staff, among others. The lottery then fills slots using the deferred acceptance algorithm, for which the lottery number breaks the ties for a subset of applicants. From 2014 through 2017, the years we're focused on today, and the first 4 years of the lottery, about 87% of applicants were matched to a program and 79% of those enrolled. I'm now going to pass to my colleague, Breno Braga, who's an economist and principal research associate at the Urban Institute, to dive into the data, the findings, and the interpretation. Breno, welcome.
Thanks, Erica. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay, so as Erica said, my name is Breno Braga, and I'm helping with the evaluation of this program. So during the rest of the presentation, I will first talk quickly about the data methods, and I hope you don't get too bored with that. But then we'll spend more time discussing the results that I think all of you came here to see. Then I'll conclude the presentation and pass the mic back to Erica. So what is the data that we use in this evaluation? So the data is coming from 3 different sources. The first one is data on all applicants to the DC pre-K lottery between 2014 and 2017. We basically have information, the same information that the lottery used to assign applicants to seats. So we know their rank choice, we know the school priorities, and we also know the random lottery draw. We do not have a lot of demographic information on those applicants. We only know their gender and whether they filled the application in English or Spanish. But the good news is that we know their home address. So therefore, we can merge this data to census data later and learn if those applicants are coming from communities of color or low-income communities. And I'll discuss this a little bit more later. The second data set we use for in this evaluation is data on all students enrolled in the DC public system between 2014 and 2019. The reason we make this year restrictions is because we want to look at outcomes before the pandemic. We use this data for 2 different purposes. The first one is to identify if pre-K3 applicants eventually enroll in a pre-K3 program, because not all applicants enroll. But we also use this data to know if this applicants enroll in kindergarten in a DC public system 2 years later. And that's actually going to be one of the outcomes, as Erica mentioned before, that we're going to look at in the study. And finally, we know from the data if the students are classified as a student that receives special education. The third data set that we're going to use is the 2010 US Census. And then, as I mentioned before, because we do not have a lot of information on the demographic of the students, but we know their residence, we're going to merge their information about the residence on characteristics from the census block where they live. So then we're going to classify students as coming from applicants as coming from low-income neighborhoods, meaning that the median income of the census block is less than $85,000, which is the median income in DC. And we're also going to classify those applicants as coming from communities of color, meaning that more than 50% of the residents of their census block are people of color. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the methods. So I'm not going to get into too much details about the methods, but I'll try to give you some intuition behind it. So our method, as Erica mentioned, explores the deferred acceptance algorithm used by the DC lottery. I'll give you the intuition how the method works. So basically, the key insight is if applicants with the same rank list and the same priority status have the same chance of being matched to a DC Pre-K3 program. So among those two students that have the same, application status, the same rank list and the same Sorry, can people hear me? Oh, sorry, my connection is unstable here for some reason. Sorry. I got lost. 1 second. Right. So the intuition here is like two students with the same rank list and the same priority status have the same chance of being matched. So among those two students with the same list being matched to a program is coming from the lottery draw. Okay, when using this method, one important restriction comes is that, as Erica mentioned, the lottery number will not determine the match to all the students, right? So, for example, if I apply to an undersubscribed program, I have a 100% chance of being accepted to those programs. So the lottery will not determine my my likelihood of being matched to a DC Pre-K program and then and enrolled in there. So we have to make this restriction we have to make this sample restriction to those applicants whose enrollment in a Pre-K3 program is impacted by the lottery draw. And that means that we're going to have to restrict the sample to basically students applying to oversubscribed programs without any priority status. Right, so why that's important for us. So here you can see characteristics in the first column of all the students that apply to the lottery between 2014 and 2017. And then in the right column, the evaluation sample is actually those students for whom the lottery impacts their, match to a program. And you can see, as Erica mentioned, we are then restricting the sample to only 24% of all the students. But then what is important to say here is the children in the evaluation sample are more likely to live in a richer, more educated, and wider neighborhood than the average applicant to the lottery. And the reason for that is that there is a smaller offer of Pre-K3 seats in the wealthier areas of DC. So if you live in one of the wealthier areas in DC, it's more likely that you're going to be applying. It's more likely that you don't have priority status and you'll be applying to a oversubscribed program. So the way to the way to interpret the results for the overall population of applicants here is the impact of the policy if there is an expansion to the program, meaning that it's going to affect those that are like in the margin of enrollment or not. But then to address this restriction later, we'll look separately at the effects of the programs on applicants coming from communities of color and applicants coming from low-income communities. So that's going to give us a sense of the effects of the program for like a more diverse set of population. All right, so what are the primary outcomes that we're looking at? So we're going to look at two primary outcomes, and those two primary outcomes are available for everyone applying to the Pre-K3 lottery. So first, we're going to look for, if you apply to the Pre-K3 lottery, we're going to follow you 2 years later, and we're going to look if you enrolled in a DC public system in kindergarten. So basically, we have an indicator if the person that applied, for the student that applied to the Pre-K3 lottery, if the person eventually enrolled in kindergarten in DC. The second primary outcome that we're going to look at is persistent in the DC public system. So if you apply to the lottery, we're going to look if you enrolled both in PK4 in the next year and then in kindergarten the following year. So two like persistent in the system from PK3 to kindergarten. So in terms of secondary outcomes, we're going to look, those secondary outcomes are only available for people that are actually, we see in the data enrolling in kindergarten in DC. So we have to make this restriction there. But then we're going to see if the student is classified as a special education student. We're also going to look if the student moved to a new DC public school from PK4 to kindergarten. And also we're going to look if the student is retained in kindergarten, meaning the student studied 2 consecutive years in kindergarten in the DC public system. All right, so let's talk a little bit about results. All right, I would say this is probably the main result of the presentation, and I'm showing results in terms of regression tables, so I'll try to interpret those for you. So the main finding that we have is basically that enrolling in a DC public pre-K3 program increases the likelihood of enrolling in a DC public kindergarten 2 years later. So if by chance you get a good lottery number and you end up getting a seat in the DC pre-K3 program, that's increased the likelihood of enrolling this in a kindergarten in DC as well by 18.5 percentage points. So basically, you get a seat by chance, you enroll in the pre-K3 program, you're 18.5 percentage points more likely to also be enrolled in a DC public system in kindergarten. We find even stronger effects on persistence. So if you get a seat by chance in the lottery and you you end up enrolled in a PK3 program, then you are 37.2 percentage points more likely to persist in the system from PK4 to kindergarten. So those are expressive numbers there. In terms of secondary outcomes, we find that we find some suggestive evidence that enrolling in the pre-K3 program increases the likelihood that you are classified as a special education student in kindergarten by 10.4 percentage points. This is actually, we think it's a good outcome. So we want students that need the special attention to be classified as soon as possible as special education. We also find significant effects on school mobility. So if by chance you get a seat in a DC pre-K3 program, you're less likely to move schools between PK4 and kindergarten. We do not find much effect on retainment in kindergarten or ever retainment, like anytime between PK4 and kindergarten. We're not very surprised by those numbers because retainment at this early grade is very uncommon. I think it's only 0.9% of all the students are retained there. So it's such a rare event that it's very hard to detect any possible effect. Okay, so now we're going to look at different groups of students and see for whom the effects are stronger. So as I mentioned before, we do not have information on demographics of the students. So that means that we have to classify students based on the where they're coming from. So what we see here, it's basically we find the same positive effects that we have for the all population here on kindergarten enrollment. We find those positive effects also for student applicants coming from communities of color and also from applicants coming from low-income communities. So if anything here, we find even stronger effects for those applicants. So meaning that the effects on the persistent in the public system tend to be stronger for those applicants coming from more disadvantaged communities. We also find positive effects for both females and male applicants, but here, there's not much difference there between the two groups, so we don't want to make much of a case there. So the same results basically happening when we look at persistent in the C public system. So again, persistent in the system is not just enrolled in kindergarten, but also enrolled in PK4. We find positive effects for all the groups. And if anything, we find stronger effects from applicants coming from communities of color and applicants coming from low-income communities. Same thing with special education status. Tend to find positive effects from students from different groups. Of course, when we make the restriction of the sample, the standard errors tend to be larger and we have less precision on the estimations, but we tend to find positive effects for all types of students. All right. As I mentioned before, we're just looking at outcomes in kindergarten. We actually can follow students all the way to second grade, to first grade and second grade. So we're going to look at those effects as well. The caveat here is that as we get to these later grades, we lose cohorts of applicants because we have this restriction of not looking at outcomes after the pandemic. But basically, what we find here is that the same positive effect that we find on kindergarten enrollment, we also find in first grade and second grade, meaning if by chance you get a seat in a pre-K3 program, you're more likely to also be enrolled in the public system in first grade and second grade. The effects here seems to be a little smaller, and the standard errors tend to be higher, so we estimate those with less precision. But we find some like suggestive evidence that those are there. All right, so I have 4 minutes, so I'll try to go a little faster here and make sure that we can get to the conclusion. But we also look at the effect of specific types of programs. So in particular, we look at what's the effect of enrolling a dual language program in pre-K3, and also the effect of enrolling a Montessori program in pre-K3 on later outcomes. And here, I want to make one comment is like who is in the comparison group. So for the dual language evaluation, the treatment group is enrolling a pre-K3 program, public pre-K3 program that's dual language. The control group here is both enrolling in a pre-K3 public program that is not dual language, but also not enrolling in the public system at all, including and also PKIPs. So what we find is that getting a seat by chance in a dual language program in DC increases the likelihood that you persist in the DC public system later. So you're more likely to also be enrolled in the system in PK4 and kindergarten. We also find positive effects on, we also see negative effects on school mobility, meaning if by chance you get a seat in a dual language program in PK3, you're less likely to move schools between PK4 and kindergarten. The interpretation we have here is like this dual language programs are very desirable. A lot of people apply to those. So once you get a seat in a dual language program, you probably want to stay there and not move schools. And then I'll go a little quick on the Montessori because we basically have 0 effects there. So looking at all the outcomes that I had described before, we do not find any effects of getting a seat in a Montessori program affecting your persistence in the public system, or even like affecting your special education status or school mobility. And the interpretation we have here is basically that once you get a seat, Montessori programs in early education intervention. Once you receive that intervention, maybe later on you don't necessarily need to be in the same school. And I'll conclude in the last minute. So if you want to leave here with a conclusion, so students enrolled in the DC public pre-K3 program are more likely to persist in the system. They're also less likely to switch schools later. If anything, we find strong effects from applicants coming from low-income communities and communities of color. Enrollment in dual language program increases the likelihood that you persist in the system and stay in the same school. So why these findings are important? So we interpret this as positive effects. First of all, we think that decreasing school mobility is good for you. There is evidence out there that like as students move schools, that creates poor achievement, behavior problems, and great retention. We also have some questions about the quality of alternative learning environments. So especially during the pandemic, people that are outside the public system that are receiving homeschooling and private sector, we still need more evidence how effective those are. And finally, we also know that like being in the public system is good for the financial health of families and the school districts. On the families, I can speak about myself. I have 2 kids that are in preschool, and I know that it's very expensive to have those that are in the private sector. So it's good that you have access to public education. And also we know that school districts are grappling with the decline in enrollment because that affects their funding. And with that, I'll pass back to Erica.
Great, thank you so much, Bruno. We're also eager to explore the themes of early educational stability and early life stability as something that can facilitate secure attachment and the development of foundational academic and social skills. So to explore that theme and many others, I'd like to now welcome our panel to the screen to share their perspectives on these findings. Miriam Calderon is the Chief Policy Officer of 0 to 3. Pamela Morris-Perez is a professor of applied psychology at New York University Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. And Maurice Sykes is a board member of the DC Early Learning Collaborative. Feel free to all turn your video on now. In past roles, both Maurice and Miriam had direct experience with the design and rollout of DC Pre-K3. And so our first question will start with them. And that is, how do the findings presented today resonate with you? Perhaps based on your own experience or stories that may have been shared with you by others, what findings do you agree with, or what findings did you expect? Maurice, let's start with you.
Oh, sure. Well, certainly, first and foremost, I want to commend the Urban Institute for taking on this research study project, because I think it's very important. Having been one of the architects of the pre-K legislation, I am thrilled that we are looking at data collection over 15 years of being in place, because usually the first place people want to go is the student outcomes, but there are variables that contribute to student outcomes. So I certainly want to commend you, Erica, and your team and the Urban Institute for taking this on. So 15 years is a long time to have a study group that you can collect data on. So that is first and foremost. Something that was said, I think, in your opening remarks, Erica, was that 7%, I believe, of the delivery of pre-K is in CBOs. And when we thought about this legislation, I mean, we knew that most of the pre-K children would wind up in the public schools and public charter schools. That was just a given. But we asked in the legislation that 5% of the slots be set aside for community-based organizations. So I'm thrilled. Some providers are not, but I'm thrilled that we are at 7%. And I think there is a correlation between the increase in enrollment in the public and public charter schools, and it looks like in community-based organizations as well. So more than surprised, I mean, I'm delighted that we have information to look at, to scrutinize, to think about, to inform public policy. And there are no surprises. There are some eye-openers, and there are some things that I think we should consider as we move forward with this study. But I'm absolutely delighted that we have this data.
Thank you, Maurice. Miriam, you're determined.
Yeah, thanks. I am really thrilled to be here, and thanks for including me. I think I'll just start by echoing what Maurice said, that I'm so excited to see some evaluation finally, I feel like, of the DC's public pre-K program. I mean, it is, you know, like, I think, very unique among state preschool programs in our field. And I think it is interesting that we haven't seen more studies, as Maurice has said, after 15 years of such a, I think, an important program and contribution to pre-K and the status of pre-K in our country. So this is very exciting and an exciting moment. I'll make two just sort of quick points. One, on some of the findings, I want to lift up the findings related to the dual language programming and speak to those first as a former administrator at DC Public Schools of Early Education, and as a parent who prioritized bilingual education for my own children. At the time, which was very early on in the implementation of UPK in the city and at DC Public Schools, I think we saw the popularity and the demand of the programs, specifically around dual language, and really had a hope that we would be able to grow them, particularly in a diversity of schools and more Title I schools, and really thought that there was an opportunity as well to be able to enhance the dual language programs by being able to begin offering them at the pre-K3 grade levels and with pre-K4 as we expanded pre-K across the district. So it's wonderful to see those kinds of findings in terms of the continuity. And I think that, again, fits with my experience as a parent, that, you know, when you are prioritizing those kinds of programs, I think families really understand that the importance of the continuity of that in terms of the language instruction. And I think you, in my experience, has been you at least see that sort of persistence and sticking with the model, at least through the elementary school grade levels. The other thing that sort of stood out to me, and the second point I'll make, is also speaks to the time when I was an administrator there, sort of early on in implementation of UPK, and that was really around, which was another time in the city when DC Public Schools was facing declining enrollment. And so we very much had the hope, that was around 2009, with implementation of universal preschool, we very much had the hope, and that was the conversation, that families would stay in the system. And that was a part of the strategy, among others, right, to address declining enrollment. And so, I think that's what I've been reflecting on as I saw these findings, was the conversations we were having back then around the hope that universal preschool would be part of the strategy to support families staying within the system and continuing to enroll in kindergarten and persisting into the system, right? And the findings are suggestive of that, in terms of even the findings and the families staying on into first and second grade. And I think the hope was too very much that they would stay at the same school. I know those are the conversations that from pre-K on into the same school in kindergarten. At the time when DCPS, this was before my school, DC in the lottery, when DCPS ran its own lottery, we saw that already 50%. So these are the early years of universal preschool, and DC ran its own preschool lottery. We saw very much that families used the lottery both years really as the opportunity to be able to exercise the choice they had in the city. About 50% of the families in DCPS attended an out-of-boundary school. So they used both years of pre-K as the opportunity to really explore what their options were both for pre-K, but I think also already thinking ahead, right? So being able to get a slot in pre-K was the opportunity to be able to get a slot in a seat in an out-of-boundary school, and then be able to stay in that school and in that feeder pattern, right? That wasn't their in-boundary school. So that was already what we saw happening, and I think so it wasn't just about picking that pre-K program, but it was about picking that school and maybe that feeder pattern that wasn't that you're in boundary school. So there was already, that pre-K connection was already that making that commitment, I think, to the public school system and whether you were able to get your slot or not. So I will leave it at that, but thanks. I'm excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Miriam. It's great to hear your reflections. Pamela, I'd love to bring you in. What resonated with you?
Thank you so much. And I just want to start, I guess, where Maurice and Miriam started, also just applauding all of you. And both the team at Urban, Erica, Brenno, and your team, but also the sort of foresight of, the two of you that were engaged with DC Public Schools. I think what you all are doing is incredibly important, and it's incredibly important in a couple of ways. One is that, this is a highly innovative study. You're leveraging lotteries, so you're answering questions in a way that we're confident about the results. And I just want to sort of put really sort of underscore that point. The second is that you're not studying something small, right? You're studying something really large. You're studying something in action. And that's something, and that came through because you partnered together, right? Because you work directly from a city system with a research organization. And I think that has been one of the most important developments, I think, in the pre-K field, is moving towards partnership work. Because I think only through these kinds of partnerships can we ask these kinds of questions. Can you guys say, hey, we want to know if these kids persist? And you all then can figure out ways to design a study within that system to answer that question. And then it's really sort of gets rid of the whole questions of relevance, right? We used to do studies that were really small, and I was a culprit, I guess, in doing a lot of these studies that no one then could implement in the real world. And, when we found positive effects. So I think this work is incredibly valuable. And then the third piece is that you're looking at an outcome that we've largely ignored. And Erica, I love that you started with the fact that you are going to get to outcomes for kids, but I love that's not where you started today, right, in these results, because we tend to forget that some of the most important thing for families is stability, right? Is my kid going to a place today that I now have a relationship with, and that then will be an important relationship and sort of developmental space for them to continue to grow over time. And I think, as developmentalists, we tend to look year by year. We forget the kind of continuity for families and for kids and how important that is. And the fact that you looked at that and found positive effects, I think it's an area that we've largely ignored. So in terms of what resonated, I guess I just want to sort of articulate that it's all, and I think you guys were saying this as well, Maurice and Miriam, that it's not surprising that you find benefits, but but it wasn't expected that you would find these benefits. And so both of those statements, I think, are very true, right? That you found that parents who basically apply to these oversubscribed sites and get their choice pre-K at age 3 would be more likely to enroll that child in the DC public school system in their later years, right? Especially in, it sounds like pre-K and kindergarten, right? Sustained effects and through at least kindergarten enrollment. And that those effects are strongest for the kids that where stability might matter the most, the kids in low-income communities, the kids in communities of color, where stability might really, really matter, right? And really giving them sort of this, core sense of support and stability. So it makes complete sense that you get those effects. It's, again, a group of kids that we tend to find positive effects at pre-K on, but again, not always a given. And there's many, many studies where we don't find those positive effects. So I just want to sort of articulate that sort of both sides of this. Really excited about the results and the design and all the work that you all have done to get here. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Great, thank you so much, Pamela. You mentioned that some of these findings are surprising. I'm curious what else is surprising, and we'll start now with Miriam.
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't know, not not much surprising. I don't think I have a lot to say there. I think I'm still probably reflecting. Like one thing I'll say that did jump out at me just sort of right away is the overall numbers of children enrolled in pre-K 3 in the city. I think we were higher. I mean, it seemed lower. I know we talked to Erica and you said they are sort of rebounding and sort of increasing. And I know these are and they may already be higher overall than the period in this study. So, but that was just something that jumped out at me. And I think I'm still also sort of reflecting on the findings related to special education and just really trying to make sense of that. And I think as I'm understanding it, what these findings really are representing are that children who were already receiving services in pre-K, so in pre-K 3 and or pre-K 4, were continuing to receive services in kindergarten. So this what this finding is really suggesting is that that really representing continuity of special education services into the kindergarten year, which is obviously really important and great if the child is still needing those services. And so I think what that is really meaning for children who were not in community-based placements, were not in the system in pre-K, in terms of whether they are just getting identified and being determined as eligible in kindergarten for the first time is something I'm still thinking about.
Thank you for sharing that. Maurice, what was surprising for you?
Well, surprising as in shocked or surprising as in pleasantly surprised. So I am pleasantly surprised that we have stopped the out-migration of families from the public schools and public charter schools historically. And there's a reason why this legislation was universal, because Miriam's talking, our out-migration was primarily middle class and upper middle class parents. That's who was leaving. And so we intentionally crafted this legislation so that there was something in it for the middle class and upper middle class parents. Because even when DC ran its own lottery, people were lining up at night around particular schools, and they were the more affluent neighborhoods. I mean, so that is a pleasant surprise that we have stopped the out-migration of people who we had pre-K, at least one pre-K classroom in every school when I was director of early childhood programs. But the problem was we didn't have equal quality pre-K, and the legislation was based on high quality pre-K for all children, regardless of their zip code or their home language or their ethnicity or race, and stabilizing that. So I am pleasantly surprised that it is paid off in terms of retaining a population that is important for any public school district. You cannot build a high quality school district on children of poverty. It just does not work. You need that mixture of children from different backgrounds and different socioeconomic backgrounds, as well as race and ethnicity. So I am pleasantly surprised that that has happened. I am, when Miriam was talking about special ed, one of our goals is to keep children out of special ed, but if they need, so I'm curious as you all go further, I'm interested in the proportion of males in special ed, boys and girls. I think we need to look at that because boys, for a number of reasons, from studies, they get expelled at a higher rate, they get referred to special ed. So I think we should look at that and consider. And also, I'm pleased with the persistence, but when I look at the first and second grade data, and I may be off script, I'm sorry, but when we look at the first and second grade data, I would like to go deeper to see who stays by race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic background.
It's very helpful. Thank you, Maurice. Pamela.
Yeah, so I'll be quick and same, I think I said a little this before, what we saw before, what I was articulating before, what you found resonates, but was not expected, and sort of building off of that. I think the thing that is the most surprising is how large your effects are, given the fact, I mean, you find 18.5 percentage point differences for the full sample, right? Even larger, like double and triple that size for the low-income communities. Those are really, really large effects, right? That's a lot of kids that you're keeping in the system. So I think that's the biggest surprise for me. And I think it's a surprise, not because the program isn't terrific, but because you had a lot of things that could have undermined your effects. And one of the most important ones is that and you said this, sort of getting to technical a little bit, but and see if I can sort of not make this too technical, but your counterfactual, right? Your control group included a bunch of kids that were also in care arrangements and in licensed care arrangements and community-based providers. And what we know from other studies is that when we, like the Head Start Impact Study is a really good example, is that when we compare a group of kids in a program that we've sort of tried to really shore up, right? And we compare them to a set of kids that are in relatively similar programs, or maybe not quite so similar, but they're still in full day care, they're still with a teacher in a in a preschool environment. When we do those kinds of comparisons, it really washes out the results. And in the Head Start findings, we know that the differences in terms of outcomes for kids is really among those kids who are in Head Start relative to kids who would have been in a home-based environment otherwise, right? Nothing against families staying home and trying to care for their kids, but it's really hard to try to do the same kinds of things for kids that a preschool environment can do, and they can really complement the work that families are already doing. So I just want to say that sort of you get these really large effects, and you had a lot of things kind of coming at you. One, as I said, was this sort of mixed counterfactual that I think might have made them much, much smaller. And you have a relatively blunt instrument here. You're basically just looking at, do they stay in a program, right? Do they stay in the place? And probably a lot of families would have stayed, I would have expected. So that was the biggest surprise for me.
Great to hear. Thank you, Pamela. We've got such a great crowd on the call today. We have folks from the federal Department of Education and Health and Human Services, state education agencies, local education agencies, advocacy groups that work with all of those levels of government. And so now is really the question for them. What do you think the findings from DC mean for other states and cities around the country? And Pamela, we'll start with you.
Yeah. I mean, I think it shows that what DC did, which is, Maurice, as you were saying, right, offer a system to all families simultaneously, right? So that it's not we're not trying to create a separate system, right, for the families that need it the most, right? We're trying to create a system that serves everyone, and try to get everybody involved and create a system. And I think this is really unusual. That also involved 3-year-olds, right? It's really, you started, Erica, in your presentation articulating this, that most of the movement towards universal pre-K has been for 4-year-old care. So the fact that you all decided that 3-year-olds are the ones that you wanted to start getting engaged in pre-K back in whatever year you started this in a while ago, I think was really innovative. And I think what you're showing is that value of that pairing, right? Both of those, a universal system for 3s and 4s, as the sort of entree, as the on-ramp into kindergarten, first, second grade. So I think there was this movement, so I think that is, the big lesson here, number one. And, there was this movement a while ago, maybe a decade ago, around aligned curriculum, right? Pre-K to third grade curriculum. And how could we align what kids are learning, right? The only way those programs are likely to work. And there's a lot of interest in maybe pre-K alone isn't going to make the difference. We need to get kids in a pre-K program. And then we build off that learning by when they move into kindergarten, first, second, third grade. In those conversations, we largely ignored 3-year-olds, right? I just want to say that for number one. And secondly, those programs only work when kids stay in the programs, right? We can really well align what teachers are doing, but if kids are going in and out of these programs, we don't get that kind of sort of alignment and stability. And what I'm really excited about is learning now about that as we move into our next question. But I think that you're really a model for how we could do this differently next.
Great, thank you, Maurice.
Well, I do think that, DC has a long history of investment in early childhood education. I mean, way back before Head Start, it was the Anacostia Project was the prototype for what Head Start became. And so I think that we serve as an inspiration about what can be done, because people wring their hands in this field about what cannot be done. And but part of that inspiration comes from activists and advocates who have put children and the welfare of children at the center of our conversations with policymakers and people who the financial, our limited government that we have, because we are, taxation without representation, but that's another topic for another day. But, in our sort of city state but there has been strong advocacy. I mean, I'm looking at Miriam, who's now at 0 to 3, but in our original legislation, we had birth to 5. And we were told by the legislators to take the infant toddler out of our legislation because, and to quote that particular legislator, it trivialized our work. However, we now have a under 3 legislation, birth to 3 for all DC. So we have, and I mean, I'm saying that because it is comprehensive. And it doesn't even just start with 3-year-olds, it starts in utero, and we go from there. And so while we're now looking at pre-K, but the advocates and activists went back and went to our legislators and said, we have to have birth to 3. And I think that's important because as we look at the continuum, we can't overlook what happens to children before they are born and that. So I think the boldness and the courage of everyone who, because there's always internal struggles when you're trying to, and Miriam knows this very well, trying to move public policy forward. And so everyone has their opinion, trying to negotiate those differences and come to something. And I always say, what are the outcomes for children? Because we have too many adult conversations. How does this impact the well-being of children? So I think we serve as an inspiration of what can be done, because people in early childhood spend a lot of time talking about what can't be done. And so it's hard to replicate because every community has its own political, social, cultural, and educational and economic context. And we're just fortunate to have legislators who get it about children.
Yeah, I just have to pick up on what Maurice said. I often say, DC doing pre-K in such a big and bold way, the way that they did really did call into question, well, why not birth to 3 in the same way? And certainly, as Maurice said, I think, at that time they wanted to do infants and toddlers as well, along with pre-K. But I think, so every, has it played out differently, but I think it certainly has, I think did lay important groundwork for now the incredible stuff DC is doing in the infant and toddler policy space as well. I think, and in terms of relevance too, you know, I think a lot of cities and states are still looking at just it starting with pre-K 4 to Pamela's point, and I think this is very relevant right now in terms of lifting up the importance of 3-year-olds. And again, I think thinking about, to Maurice's point, the connections with infants and toddlers, and learning from DC's example and story, I think is really, really important, including what they're doing now. I mean, I'll say the obvious as well, you know, and you talked about it at the beginning, Erica, declining enrollment in K is happening right across the country and in many cities. And so this is very relevant and timely because I think more and more places are going to look to pre-K as a solution to that. And, you know, and we'll look to these findings. And then I'll make one other point, which is, I think, you know, we talk a lot as well about choice and having a lot of choice in our system. And that is, you know, a big value, as you can see here in DC, right? In terms of there being a lot of choice in the city, still in the CBO sector, within charters, within DC public school in terms of options, and then within those different sectors, right, in terms of variability in terms of programming. And I think another lesson here is really the infrastructure to support that with my school DC. And I think one thing I would hope to see is that, you know, one day CBOs, Head Start, right, would be part of that system as well. It would not be great for this evaluation and your methodology, but I think that is another lesson. When I think back to, you know, a do-over that I would have had, I think some more coordination, particularly for families and supporting them and exercising the choice that they had early on when we were building these programs back in my day would have been ideal. And now the city has it, and I think continuing to grow on it, including CBOs, would be great.
That's great to hear. This is our last question. I'd invite the audience to include any questions that they may have in the Q&A. Hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes to address them at the end, and we can follow up over email as well. But we are fortunate on our study team to have support from the Heising-Simons Foundation and the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences to keep the study ongoing. We'd love to hear from you. What other questions should we try to answer in the coming years? And we'll start with Maurice.
Well, I think that we have the infrastructure that supports the kind of data gathering that you're doing in this study. I think that we have stood up over these past 15 years, the mechanisms that need to be in place. However, I continue to be concerned about child outcomes. I agree that that's not where we needed to start, Pamela and Miriam, I agree, but now we need to begin to look at that because we need to ensure, as we promised, that we would have high quality programs across the city. And all programs are not equal. From your data collection, the class, which was not its intention, but it's our point of reference about how we're doing. And I am deeply concerned on a scale of 7 that instructional support, which tells us what is the quality of interaction between adults and children, is low. I don't know if it's 2.9, but it's 2 TOO low for children of color and children of poverty. And so I think that we need to begin to look at that, certainly as children move up and I'm pleased to hear that you are going to look at the 3rd grade assessment, but that is what's important. Yes, we have a lot of programs, but do we have a lot of quality? Because that is the on-ramp for children to be successful in school and in life. So that's what I would be.
That's very helpful, Maurice. Thank you. Pamela.
Yeah, so just a couple quick things because I know we're almost out of time. So, you know, I love that you're going to look at outcomes. I completely agree, Maurice, we need to get to them. So understanding the link between these enrollment impacts and potential, you know, outcome impacts, I think is going to be incredibly important. When you do that, my hope is you can do 2 other things. One is understand the effects, not only for the individual child, but sort of at the population level, right? You've changed the system. and you've changed the system for groups of families, right? Not just individual families. And I'm really curious about the ways in which this sort of these stability effects sort of play themselves out into sort of ongoing effects, not only for like me, right? I'm a child, right? I'm a child, like going through the system, but in terms of the sort of ways in which teachers then can take on, right? I now have a whole group of kids who've been with me for a little bit longer. I can now build on their learning in a different kind of way, right? And you're going to get that kind of feedback back and forth then as kids kind of move through the system. So I'm really curious about that sort of at the group level, right? That kind of interplay rather than just at each kid level, right? And then finally, and I'm sure you can't answer this, but eventually I hope you do, you raised a lot of the relevance of this work for post-pandemic enrollment challenges. I am hoping that you're going to be able to understand the extent to which you're getting these kinds of effects in a post-pandemic world also, right? The world is different. I would suspect they would be similar, but I think it will be really important to test that to understand that as well. So I'm excited to see where this work goes.
Great, thank you. And Miriam, for the last word.
Sure. Yeah. I have a few things. One is I believe that identification of dual language learners is starting in pre-K, happens in the pre-K 3 classroom. So I'm interested to see what you might be able to do with looking at services, continuity, eventually outcomes. I think that would be a really important contribution for the field. I think not a lot of pre-K programs across the country systematically are identifying dual language learners beginning at the pre-K grade levels. I think the role of Head Start would be really important to look at across the system. There are a variety of different ways that that's happening in terms of partnerships within DCPS as well as charters, and as well given the fact that Head Start DC Public Schools has been a Head Start grantee since the late 60s, and did things in terms of how that changed the way Head Start worked within the public school system, and while I was there, we made the Head Start performance standards applicable to all the pre-K classrooms and all of the Title I schools. That also created some changes with how Head Start worked in the community-based programs as well, and really led to a lot of expansion and conversion to early Head Start, as well as the city has invested a lot in early Head Start as well. So I think there's a lot of different ways. I think now, some of the community-based grantees in the city, might be some of the largest early Head Start providers in the country. So I think the opportunity of like 5 years, some children getting 5 years of Head Start, right, is also really interesting and exciting. I think I'll echo what Maurice said about outcomes. And then the last point I'll say really around quality. Equity is more than just access to a slot, right? It is the experience of children and families in the program. And I'd really be interested to really look at what children and families are experiencing, particularly in schools. We still have a lot of schools that are very segregated racially and economically, because the neighborhoods are very segregated racially and economically. And I particularly want to see, again, a universal policy, and universal access doesn't mean, you universally get quality. And so with an eye towards what is happening in terms of quality in some of those racially and economically segregated neighborhoods and schools.
Thank you. Lots of food for thought and lots more work to come from our team. We welcome this continued conversation, including with all of the attendees today. We could easily continue the conversation for another hour, but we are unfortunately at time. So thank you all for your time. Thank you for your engagement, and special thanks to Brenno, Miriam, Pamela, and Maurice. Folks, please take a minute or two to fill out our survey, and don't hesitate to reach out with any additional questions or if our team can ever be helpful. Thanks again, and have a great week.